Good afternoon. My name is Maureen Hughes, and I am the Director of Training and Resource Development at the Literacy Coalition of New Brunswick. It is my pleasure to welcome you to our Literacy and Essential Skills in the Workplace webinar series. Today we present the third webinar in this series, Building a Learning Culture in Your Workplace. Our presenter today is Rick Hutchins, Essential Skills Specialist from the National Adult Literacy Database. Before I introduce Rick, though, I'd like to draw your attention to the dashboard on the right side of your screen. You will see a question box in which you can type any questions during the webinar. Rick will answer your content-related questions at the end of his presentation. If your question is of a technical nature, I will respond as quickly as possible during the webinar. And with that, it is my pleasure to introduce today's presenter, Rick Hutchins. As an essential skills consultant, Rick has extensive workplace experience with a number of national and regional organizations. Rick teaches courses in community problem solving and social policy at the University of New Brunswick and St. Thomas University, both located in Fredericton, New Brunswick. Rick has worked extensively as a community development practitioner in the not-for-profit sector and as a project manager for various organizations throughout Canada. Rick is a trained facilitator and strategic planner with a wide range of experience in both areas. Welcome, Rick.
Thanks a lot, Maureen. I'm excited to actually be here today. This is my first webinar, so a bit of a learning experience on my end as well. Today's topic, we're going to be talking about building a learning culture in your workplace. It's an extremely relevant topic given a lot of the challenges that many of us face that work in workplace learning, either as educators, facilitators, animators, managers, or even in workplaces themselves. Learning does not just happen, and I think all of us that work in the field know that. So when you talk about building a learning culture, quite often if you're going to bring that type of discussion into the workplace, you have to be able to explain what that is to the workplace so that they can start embracing it and moving with the concept of building a learning culture. And I think that the whole idea behind today's workshop is, given the fact it's a pretty short amount of time of about half an hour, I'm going to try and focus on two really major themes that affect workplace learning. And as you'll follow through the slides, some of them are in there and some of them we can just keep in the back of our minds as we move forward. The first one is that when you're building a learning culture in the workplace, you need to be able to assess the culture that exists within that workplace. Most of you, I think actually all of you, would have received an article that I attached that was written by Marcia Connor. And in it, it goes through a fairly deep discussion around how to build workplace learning culture, but also she refers to at the end of the document doing an audit. And I think that's one of the essential learnings that we're going to get out of today's webinar. The notion that you really do have to evaluate and look at learning culture in the workplace. In many workplaces, we do see workplaces that will say, well, you know, we have an issue with learning, we're going to do training or we're going to do something. But when you dig deeper to try and evaluate whether or not there's a learning culture, quite often you will find that many workplaces actually do not have an extensive concept of learning in the workplace. So the idea for a lot of us, hopefully, is to be agents of change, to change the way workplaces do this. And there's many different ways to do that. I'm just going to move my slide now. There we go. So the issue of workplace learning culture has become increasingly important in the development of workforce skills. Key strategy for achieving this is the promotion of workplace learning in the context of lifelong learning to ensure that workers' skills are constantly renewed and adapted and to equip them for a wide variety of potential jobs. This requires a better understanding of workplace learning culture. So I think all of us, as we move forward, probably need to have a better understanding of the importance of workplace culture when we try and work with different types of employers and different types of organizations. Quite often the terminology that's used in our field, unfortunately, quite often is deficit-based. And what I mean by that, it's usually about workplaces looking at trying to correct something or change something and for multiple purposes, but not always in a sustained way. So I think it's important that we understand the importance of culture and be able to transfer the importance of that culture when we talk to workplaces. I'm just going to move into the shift of thinking, because the shift of thinking in workplace learning is a cost to seeing it as an investment. For a lot of us that work in the field of essential skills development or work directly with workplaces, there always has to be a logic model or a way of explaining to workplaces why they should be looking at investing in learning. And I mean, you know, there's so much information out there. I don't think I'm going to spend as much time on this, but some of the ones that are there, the improvement in the current job. When you invest in workplace learning, there's improvement in the current job performance. We have statistical evidence to back that up across the board. However, once again, the key is improvement in the current job, trying to refer back to the concept of culture, not just a training program or not just an intervention. The idea that a workplace that understands a culture of learning will have constant improvements because they'll constantly be looking at new ways to learn and new ways to improve and to integrate learning into the workplace. The improvement of the quality of goods and services falls the same way. We know that workplaces that have effective learning strategies and embrace learning are constantly improving quality in their production, and more importantly in the quality of the workers themselves and the way they look at work, wanting to be at work, wanting to be part of an organization that embraces learning. And there's a lot of evidence in the workplaces when you look at companies that do this well. And again, a lot of case studies that are available to people when you're looking for this type of information. And that is one of the recommendations I will make to the folks that are listening to the webinar, is that when we're working with businesses and industry in particular, the concept of business to business is one of the best ways to get traction around this issue. And what I mean by that is if you find a business that is operating well with a solid understanding of learning, that's your case study, that's your introduction, that's your way of explaining this to another employer. What works in the world of business resonates very strongly with employers. We can present a lot of evidence, but in reality, most of them want to see exactly what works. Responding to new technology is another interesting area because we know that in workplaces right now, technology is presenting a lot of challenges, especially in the world of learning, because as we move to more technology-based industries, we recognize that employees have to change the way that they do their work. They have to learn new skills, and to learn new skills, it's one thing to introduce training in the technology, but lo and behold, we find there's also the need to understand how they learn. And how they learn is a whole different set of skill sets in the workplace. And this is where we know, and I keep saying we know because most of you that are on the webinar work in the field or support the field, we know that quite often how a worker learns is extremely important to get traction in the learning. And so that whole notion of coming in and doing a bit of an audit or a bit of a reflection on how that workplace is extremely important. Developing a more flexible workforce, improving employee safety in the workplace, those are examples of giving, certainly when you're trying to promote workplace learning and developing a culture, using that language to the employer that's the language they're familiar, which is the language of a return on investment or increased productivity. But also very important for all of us to recognize that safety is another issue in the workplace that's becoming more and more prominent. And when we look at the concept of workplace learning culture, we can actually use that as an example when we're talking to employers. And let me use this as an example now as we talk about it. In a workplace, most workplaces, mostly medium and larger in particular, maybe not as much smaller, would have health and safety policies in place. So the reality is they've embraced a culture in a lot of cases that supports the need for employees to understand what is a healthy workplace, what is a safe workplace, what are the policies and procedures to work with that. So many of you can use that as an example and then turn around and ask the same employer whether or not they have a learning policy. And it's interesting to think about this because most don't, certainly not an official one. So when you're trying to talk about this with employers, think about what they actually already have and then maybe build upon that by looking at existing structures that actually are policy-based, because a workplace learning policy can be a very interesting new strategy for employers, certainly a way to engage them in moving forward on learning. what does a learning environment look like? And I'd like you as participants to think about this, because the approach that I use in the work that I do, Maureen had mentioned a lot of my work has been as a community development practitioner, and I embraced many years ago the McKnight model, which some of you may be familiar with, which is called asset-based community development. And what that is as we approach these types of questions and as we try to move agendas like trying to create learning environments, we approach it from an asset base. And what I mean by that is there's definitely a lot of people that approach things from a deficit outlook. An employer may look and say to you, well, you know, I have workers that don't know what they're doing right now. Obviously, I need to train them. I have a deficit in how they're able to do what they do. I'd like for us to start thinking about turning that around and saying, well, your workers actually are a huge asset, and look at investing in them in assets and using asset-based approaches. And these are, in the world of work, these are creative approaches too. So the first thing is a learning environment with a policy framework that's been designed and initiated by all levels of the organization. And if I asked any of you, how many of you would have that in your organization right now? That's a very quick question. Do we have a policy framework that's been designed and initiated by all levels of the organization that frames out how we learn in our organization? The reality is, in most cases, we don't. And I'm not necessarily saying that we all need something that formal, but what we do need to do is to talk about workplace learning and talking about it from a cultural perspective, but traction quite often comes when you put that into some form of policy. And what I like to use is, when I talk to organizations, I use examples of, you have a workplace health and safety policy framework. You have harassment policies in the workplace. There's all sorts of policies that govern the way you do things. So there's a framework for doing that. There's an understanding in most businesses on how to create policy. But it can be quite exciting to try and promote the notion of having a learning policy, which is what supports, of course, a learning culture. The second question is, are there clear opportunities for learning in the workplace, both formal and informal? Are opportunities resourced and available to all staff? So I would ask you as participants in the webinar, if you just took a minute and sat down and wrote down one policy or strategy that your organization has that supports workplace learning. Ideas can include training programs, resources available for learners, informal learning activities, manuals, policy directives, learning space. The reason is, if you do that, we're starting, in your case, and the same thing with employers, from an asset base, what we already have as a building block, not what we don't have as a building block. So that when you're talking to employers, instead of challenging them that they're not doing this and that there's a problem, it's actually saying, most of you are, let's just take it to the next level. And my experience has been, when you start with this type of an exercise with employers, you get extremely positive feedback when they realize it's not that they're not doing certain things. It's that in a lot of cases they actually haven't articulated those or haven't formulated them into some form of policy or framework that they can move forward. And I'd like to go back to, because I said this to you in the beginning, it's an amazing challenge to have half an hour to talk about this particular topic. And so I'd like to introduce to all of you at this point in the discussion is my service guarantee to all of you, which is there's a lot of more material available on this topic. There's a lot of resources. We do have a lot of them actually on our site at NALD, which is a National Adult Literacy Database. And you'll notice on the first slide and again at the end you'll see my email address. So I'd like to be able to support you and give that service guarantee that if there's any additional questions or materials you're looking for, I'd be happy to try and send them to you. This one particular thing, I said there were a couple of highlights to the presentation because we're actually almost halfway through. The first one is, start thinking about a workplace learning culture from the perspective of policy that supports that. Because you quite often have employers that get that type of framework. That's the world they work in. When you frame it in such a way as said, you know, you have, once again, you have health safe policies. Why? Because they're there to, in some cases, to ensure a safe working environment. Why do you write it down? Why do you offer training? Why do you have policy mailing those available? Why do you have safety teams in the workplace? And in almost every case, it's because they do get it. This is an area they get. So there is actually a lot of learning that goes on. So a lot of our job is not to promote change from a perspective of a deficit or a negativity, but to say, you know, you already have a workplace learning culture. Let's build upon it. Let's make it better. This next slide challenges a lot of people. And I've had challenges from employers on this, but I use it as a way to stimulate further discussion. And I use the term training is not learning. And for a lot of employers, especially if they're looking at it from a deficit perspective, they may disagree. They may say, I had a problem with production. I sent 9 of my people off to training on how to use the new machine. I have done my part. Everything is in place. Why would you say training is not learning? Well, the reality is in the workplace, if you do send people to training and you don't support that with additional support when they come back from training, quite often the traction, and I refer to traction, isn't there. The expectation of more may be there, but the reality is, what are you doing to support that learning? So business, government, NGOs often mistakenly equate training with learning. Although these terms are often used interchangeably, they are distinct concepts. Most learning at work happens through the everyday working practices in interaction with other workers. In other words, if you send some workers off to training or you bring a training program in, and your view as an employer is that that will correct the issue, and I'm just going to stand back and let it all do itself, is not going to work for you 9 times out of 10. What will work for you is to have a continuous culture of learning that supports that and also supports the integration, let's say if it's technology, with further opportunities for learning. And that's a learning culture. That's the difference. Training is instruction for learning a specific task. Learning, on the other hand, is a continuous process. Now, again, I'm not assuming that some people would not challenge that theory. I offer training courses as a professional, but I usually tell people when they take the training course, it's not over. Don't stop here. Go further. Look further. And start looking at learning as a culture as opposed to training as being the only way to move things forward. Every workplace actually has a learning culture, and I started talking about this earlier. Working practices are often influenced by outside factors. Government regulation, WHS stands for Workplace Health and Safety, for example. Improving the learning culture supports the workplace learning. So understanding the importance of culture is an important first step for employers beyond a training program. And that's one of the ways I do introduce this discussion to employers. So I said the first highlight of what we're trying to talk about is to understand that the notion of a learning culture has more to do with traction and how we engage learning in the workplace. And I'd asked all of you a few slides back to write 1 or 2 things that you do in your existing organization right now, and that's where I think you see the positive or the asset-based approach really working, because I think we all have some. And it's from those some we saw how much more can we do and what can we do to build it better. Employers recognize that learning is an essential part of almost any job at one point, but more importantly, it's a constant thing. And that's what we need to do. So the first and most important message probably out of this workshop is that learning culture does exist. Let's go into the workplaces and try and promote that language and try and promote the idea of having it as a sustained culture. Some of you may or may not choose to use my language, which is learning is more than training. But it is a way to enter into a discussion with employers, because there are employers out there and a lot of industries that would actually challenge that and say, I invest substantial amounts of dollars into training. Why would you say that to me? I'm not even remotely attempting to challenge the concept of training. I'm trying to get the employers to think, your investment is solid. Take it to the next level. Promote learning, and promote learning in a larger context beyond training that includes so many other things that are important in the workplace. And that's where we're at right now. And the second piece that I was hoping to emphasize, and again in such a short webinar, is the case for learning is extremely important to the employer. We talked earlier about the sort of return on investment approach to try and get them involved in there. But the reality is there's significant and noticeable advantages of learning organizations. And you notice I use that term, a learning organization. And if we do our work properly in promoting the concept of culture, we're actually promoting learning organizations. We're trying to change the way people look at the way they operate as businesses. Learning organizations, in learning organizations, you can see, going back to the outcomes, a reduction in errors and mistakes. When workers recognize and learn from mistakes early, they can quickly adapt to change, which increases productivity and improves morale. But that particular bullet speaks volumes to the ability for them to learn from mistakes and to learn from the workplace itself. And the idea is what kinds of processes, what kinds of things are in place to do that. And there's a lot of subtleties related to this discussion. A lot of subtleties. You know, how do we promote a learning culture in terms of supporting a reduction in errors and mistakes? We've heard many terms used in the workplace. The idea of shadowing workers. On the formal end, there's lots of process. On the informal end, I remember recently having a discussion with an employer that realized something as simple as having magazines, periodicals, and information available in the lunchroom on new technologies and techniques for their employers. And the employer said to me, well, that's just putting magazines in the lunchroom. I said, no, actually, that's promoting a learning culture. And learning organizations do that. They constantly look for these opportunities to create more opportunities to learn. A happier and more engaged workforce. A supportive learning culture helps to motivate and reward employees for taking initiative. There's absolutely no question. Many of us in the work that we do deal with a specific area of learning, which is around literacy and around skill development, in a lot of cases in trying to improve workers' capacities to both compete and be productive in today's workforce. And a lot of that is through skill development, through essential skills. But the reality is, for a lot of the workers in the workplace, we don't want that deficit-based approach to dominate. What we want to do is to have them learn inside a learning organization, so that they're not separated from the organization as an element of corrective measures. We're going to invest in these workers that need to be fixed or whatever. And I realize that terminology may be a bit rough, but in a lot of workplaces, that's kind of it. So I'm not just promoting employers investing in essential skills training for their employees. I'm really promoting to you that we push a much larger agenda, which is around workplace learning from a perspective of actually having a culture in place that supports that learning. So how do you create these learning opportunities at work? And this sort of takes me to pretty much the end of the discussion here. There's so many ways to promote learning in an organization. You have formal education as a learning opportunity, and this would be courses, workshops, programs. And once again, when you do that concept of an audit or the investigation up front when you talk to an employer, when you're taking your notes, a lot of these things are going to show up. Employers do some of these things. They just don't look at them as a concept of a culture of learning. So formal education is a learning opportunity, courses, workshops, programs. Self-directed learning is one of the newer ones that's gaining incredible momentum, and a lot of that is because of technology, the use of the internet, access to learning, access to additional tools. And that's a learning opportunity. It could be a journal article, the internet itself, the use of the library. For a lot of workplaces, the idea is, again, something as simple as putting more of this accessible to the employees. I've talked to a few employers that have gone out and invested in setting up a computer in the staff lounge and encouraging employees to go out and find interesting stuff and then bookmark it so other employees can look at it. Opportunities within the job as a learning. Coaching, mentoring, peer review, job rotation, shadowing are all critical elements of an effective workplace learning culture. Opportunities outside the job, which is something that's quite often not discussed but should be supported by employers. Learning opportunities, visits to other centers and sites, and that would be, for example, if you're in a manufacturing business in a small town, put everybody into a couple of cars and go to another manufacturing plant in the next town. Yes, look at what they do, but also look at how they learn. And this promotes learning and recognizing that there's always new and different ways we can do things. And then conference presentations, allowing your employees and the people that work with you to go to these types of things to learn from others. Community events, and a lot of people say, I don't understand how that relates to the world of work. Again, a learning culture will support the participation of the workers in their community because you learn. You learn in so many different ways. And to support that kind of participation, it's an unbelievable growth that you would see by being supportive as an employer. And when you look at a lot of these things, if you did the audit exercise that Marcia Connor had put at the end of the document that I sent you, I'm not suggesting that you use the exact same framework that she put in there, but if all of you thought about creating a similar type of just a really quick inventory before we start talking to the employer about what they're going to do, where are they at right now when it comes to learning, and where do they want to be, and how can we assist them to do that? And the whole idea here is to really frame things around creating a culture. And so I only got about 5 minutes left in the presentation, but the two things that I wanted to emphasize the most were a learning culture. You're going to have to explain this to employers. Most of them don't necessarily use that terminology. The irony is many of them have the basic building blocks in place. It's already there. So if we're going to be agents of change in this case, we're going to promote it from a perspective of what you, not what you don't have, but what you do have, and try and build from there and start discussing ideas. And employers that do that and then send this information out to their employees and say, we would like to be a learning organization, will get so much more traction, support, they'll be more appealing to their employees, and more importantly, learning will happen as a constant exercise, something that you embrace within your organization. And then the second piece, once again, that I tried to emphasize earlier, but to put it in the right context, is that right now the challenges that a lot of us are facing, especially in the literacy field, is that we're trying to approach, for example, essential skills or literacy training in the workplace outside of the institution of the workplace. And I think by promoting workplace culture, we're integrating it into that. We're not making it an exclusive exercise, or I want to fix the following 9 employees. I promote learning at all levels. That happens to be an opportunity for them. It's much more of an integrated and, more importantly, an inclusive process. When an employer says they have a workplace learning culture for everybody, it does not exclude those that may have more challenges with learning. And that's pretty much the gist of the presentation. I don't know if there's any questions at this point. This is the time that I would run through them. If not, I will I'll wait if they are. If you do have questions, please put them through. I will go back to what I said in the very beginning, which is please send me an email. You have my information on the slide, rickhutchins@nald.ca. Please feel free to ask additional questions. If you're looking for resources, anything that I can help you with, I really feel strongly about this particular topic. And I hope that most of you have benefited, at least from the basis of what is, for the most part, a very quick discussion on the opportunity. There are oh, there is a question. There we go. Just waiting. We have a minor technology here where Maureen is actually writing this on a whiteboard for me. Okay, so the question once again, and thank you for whoever sent this in, can you suggest what workplace factors may influence learning? I mean, obviously, there's so many of them there. One of them would be the overall support from the workplace. So if you have an owner of a workplace that, as they say, doesn't get it and doesn't support learning, that's one of the major factors for sure that influences learning, is the institution of the workplace itself, and making sure that there's some support for that. Other factors that would influence learning, though, is I go back to not having a learning policy, to me, is a factor that can influence learning. And what I mean by that is a policy framework, something that outlines this is how learning happens in our workplace, these are the things that we support, these are the opportunities that are available to you. And what that tends to do is it tends to show the support to the workers. So absolutely there are a number of factors that would stop, curtail, slow down, or make learning difficult in the workplace. Almost all of them relate to the philosophical approach of the owner, the management team towards learning. So, you know, there really are institutional factors. Many other ones which I call soft factors, the time to learn in a productive environment. We're on an assembly line, when do we get a chance to learn? Those challenges are, again, decisions that have to be brought forward as to how do we create learning opportunities. I did have this discussion with one employer, and we ended up with an incredible lunchroom, basically, because they did not see the opportunities for learning exercises as part of the regular work. It was mostly assembly line work. So They invested in having lunch and learns, brown bag opportunities for their staff, people coming and talking to them at lunchtime, just a whole bunch of different areas. So I think the key is on that first question, take the deficits approach, try and throw it out the window and try and convince the employer to start removing whatever barriers may be there. And I think that's the greatest factor, would be barriers. There was another question on articles on workplace factors such as workplace culture, leadership. What I can do on that for whoever's asking the question or for the rest of you, I would be happy to, because I think we can all understand the framework of a 1.5 hour webinar. Again, my service guarantee, and it's part of my commitment to this whole notion of learning culture, feel free to send me an email. There are certainly articles, there are certainly a whole bunch of sort of how-tos, promotional ideas on learning culture, creative, effective learning organizations. There's a lot of resources out there, absolutely. So to that question, resources. I would also challenge all of you as learners, and some of you probably already know this, but if you spend some time on the internet yourself and start using Google or looking at a site like NALD, National Adult Literacy Database, where I work, you will find resources. A lot of it, ironically, is in how you put your search words together. So when you start searching words like learning culture, 3 or 4 years ago, you wouldn't have found very much on that search. You're going to find more now because there's more articles and there's more traction to that terminology. So, but whoever asked the question, feel free to send me an email and I will try and send you some URLs and particular sites. For all of you, I included Marcia's article because it was one of the better ones that I found out there that really speaks to some of the challenges in integrating workplace learning culture. And at this point, we don't have any additional questions. So I think we're moving towards the end of the webinar. I'd like to thank you all very much for signing up. Hopefully there's been some certainly some information that may prompt you to move forward. What I'd like everybody to think of, though, is that creating learning environments and learning cultures does not just happen. And for a lot of employers that are up against this notion of productivity index, globalization, competitiveness, they can even not intentionally overlook learning in this broader context and start thinking of it as training. And statistics will show that if you invest in learning and create learning cultures, you're a better organization, especially if you do it and start from an asset-based approach. Don't go in and try and put a hammer between somebody's eyes. Come in with that velvet hammer which says, let's start with what you have and let's build from there. So thank you very much, and thank you, Maureen, for having me do this webinar with the Coalition for Literacy, and I hope it's been a good experience.
Thank you, Rick, and thank all of you for joining us today. It was a great pleasure to have so many people from such varied sectors of the community take part in our webinar. If you have any further questions or follow-up for Rick, please feel free to contact him at the coordinates seen on your screen there. Rick, can you flip that? There we go. rick.hutchins@nald.ca. Have a wonderful day, everyone, and thank you for joining us.